Imagine a woman whose beauty was described not merely as outstanding, but as a divine fluke of nature, an anomaly that defied all laws of harmony. A woman who, with a single glance from her sultry, half-closed eyes, drove millions of men worldwide to madness, whose face became a symbol of Hollywood's golden age, a standard of glamour and unattainable elegance. Now, imagine that this very same woman, in between filming on lavish studio sets and attending high society events where she glittered in diamonds, would lock herself in her library, spread a large sheet of drawing paper on the floor, and perform complex mathematical calculations. Calculations that, half a century later, would form the basis of Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, and all modern wireless communication systems. It sounds like fiction, like the opening of a science fiction novel about a time traveler. But this is the absolutely real, document-supported story of Hedy Lamarr. The story of Hollywood's most beautiful actress, who was also a brilliant self-taught inventor. The story of a woman who gave the world a technology we cannot imagine our lives without today, yet who never received a cent, nor a shred of recognition for her greatest discovery during her lifetime. How did a Hollywood diva, whose image was synonymous with beauty and temptation, become the godmother of modern wireless networks? Why was her greatest invention, created as a secret weapon to combat Nazi submarines during World War II, classified, ridiculed, and buried in the archives for decades? And how did a woman who seemingly had it all, beauty comparable to an ancient goddess, worldwide fame, immense wealth, end her life in poverty, obscurity, and solitude, speaking to the world only by telephone? This is a story of paradox, a story of how the sharpest mind can hide behind the most beautiful face, and how the world failed to see one for the other. To tell it, we must travel back to pre-war Europe, to the Vienna of the 1930s, a city dazzling and steeped in the aroma of coffee, the waltzes of Strauss, and the looming sense of catastrophe. She was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna in 1914 to a wealthy, assimilated Jewish family. Her father, Emil Kiesler, was a successful banker and bank director. Her mother, Gertrude Lichtwitz, was a talented pianist from the Budapest aristocracy. From her earliest childhood, young Hedy was surrounded by luxury, art, and science. She was an incredibly gifted child, equally adept at mastering the piano, ballet, and several foreign languages. But what astonished the world most was her ethereal, almost surreal, bewildering beauty. When she walked down the street as a teenager, traffic would grind to a halt. People would stop and follow her with gazes that mixed admiration with disbelief. Her father, who adored his only daughter, saw more in her than just a beautiful doll. He encouraged not only her passion for theater, but also her lively, insatiable, and inquisitive mind. He would walk with her for hours through the streets of Vienna, explaining how the first automobiles worked, how the mechanism of street lamps was designed, and how signals were transmitted over telegraph wires. He took apart music boxes with her to show how the mechanical cylinder functioned. He awakened in her something entirely uncharacteristic for girls of her social standing, a passion for technology, for understanding how the world worked, and for finding elegant engineering solutions. But the magic of cinema, that new and mesmerizing art form, proved stronger. At 16, to her parents' horror, she dropped out of her elite school and took a job at the Viennese film studio, Sasha Film. At first, she was just an assistant, an errand girl, but soon her stunning appearance, impossible to ignore, began to land her small roles. Then, in 1933, she starred in a Czechoslovakian film that simultaneously made her famous throughout Europe and became her eternal curse. The film was called Ecstasy, today's standards. It was a rather innocent art house drama about the awakening of female sensuality. But for the puritanical 1930s, it was a bombshell that shattered all notions of decency. In one scene, a 19-year-old Hedy, whose character is bathing in a lake, appears on screen completely nude for a few seconds. In another, even more scandalous scene, the camera focuses in close-up on her face, which, according to the director's vision, was meant to portray the ecstasy of intimacy with a loved one. The scandal was deafening. Pope Pius XI personally condemned the film from the pulpit. Hitler banned it from being shown in Nazi Germany, calling it Jewish pornography. Overnight, Hedy Lamarr became the most talked about and controversial actress in Europe. It was at this moment that she caught the eye of one of Austria's richest and most powerful men, Friedrich Fritz Mandl. He was an arms manufacturer, a 20th-century merchant of death, who supplied cannons, shells, and aircraft to armies around the world, unscrupulously dealing with both sides of any conflict. He was captivated, obsessed with Hedy's beauty. After seeing her in ecstasy, he decided that this woman must belong to him. He essentially bought her from her parents, showering them with gifts and promising a brilliant future for their daughter. Hedy, despite her instinctive revulsion for this domineering, cynical man, was forced to submit to her family's will. She married him. Her life turned into a nightmare, a luxurious, gilded cage. Mandl proved to be a pathologically jealous and ruthless tyrant. He forbade her from acting in films, considering it an unworthy profession for his wife. He spent a fortune trying to buy every single copy of Ecstasy so that no one in the world could see his wife naked. He controlled her every move, locking her away in their opulent Salzburg castle and allowing her to go out only in his company. She became his beautiful possession, his most prized trophy, which he proudly displayed at his receptions. But it was at these receptions, in this prison, that a deathly bored Hedy began to listen and to hear. Her husband's guests were not actors and artists. They were generals, weapons engineers, and politicians. Among them were high-ranking Nazis from Germany and fascists from Italy, including Mussolini himself. Mandl, despite being half Jewish himself, had no qualms about doing business with them. At the dinner table, to the clinking of crystal glasses, they openly discussed their affairs, paying no attention to the pretty doll, the host's young wife. They spoke of the latest weapons systems, radio-controlled torpedoes, aircraft, and guidance and encryption systems. And Hedy, with her sharp, analytical, technical mind, absorbed everything like a sponge. She memorized terms and grasped the essence of engineering problems. She was particularly interested in conversations about remote-controlled torpedo systems. She understood the main vulnerability of these systems, which the engineers constantly discussed. The radio signal controlling the torpedo was very easy to intercept or jam with interference on the same frequency. The torpedo, costing a fortune, would then go off course and become useless. This problem became firmly lodged in her mind. She understood that Europe was on the brink of a great war, and her husband was openly collaborating with the forces of evil. She, a Jew, was married to a Nazi sympathizer. Disgust and fear mixed with a desperate desire to break free. And so she began to plan her escape. One night, lulling her husband and the guards into a false sense of security, she staged her escape. According to one version, she drugged her maid, disguised herself in the maid's uniform, and slipped out of the castle through a service entrance. In her pocket, she had only a little money and a jewelry box she had managed to grab. She fled, first to Paris and then to London. In London in 1937, fate brought her into close contact with the man who would change her life for a second time. It was Louis B. Mayer himself, the all-powerful head of the Hollywood studio Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM. He was in Europe, searching for new talent to replace fading stars. He saw Hedy and was struck by her unearthly beauty. But the scandalous reputation of the ecstasy girl deterred him. He offered her a modest contract, which she proudly and contemptuously rejected. But Hedy was not only beautiful, but also smart and determined. She found out that Mayer was returning to America on the luxurious transatlantic liner Normandy. With her last remaining money, she bought a ticket for the same voyage. Throughout the 6-day journey across the Atlantic, she orchestrated accidental encounters with the mogul, each time appearing in a new, more stunning outfit from her Parisian wardrobe. She caused a sensation among the first-class passengers. By the end of the trip, Mayer was at her feet. He realized that he was in the presence of not just a beautiful woman, but a future megastar. He offered her a 7-year contract on terms that were astronomical for the time. But he set one condition. She had to forget her scandalous past. She had to be reborn, like Venus from the foam. He created a new image for her and a new, resonant, aristocratic name, borrowing the surname of a faded, silent film star. Thus, Hedwig Kiesler died and Hedy Lamarr was born. She arrived in Hollywood like a queen. MGM launched an unprecedented publicity campaign, presenting her to the public as the most beautiful woman in the world. Her very first American film, Algiers, 1938, in which she starred with Charles Boyer, made her a superstar. Men went crazy for her, and women copied her center-parted hairstyle and makeup. She became a style icon, a goddess in the Hollywood firmament. She had achieved everything she had seemingly dreamed of: freedom from her tyrant husband, worldwide fame, and enormous wealth. But she soon realized she had escaped one gilded cage only to willingly enter another, no less confining. In Hollywood, her mind, her knowledge, her ideas were of no use to anyone. Producers saw in her only a beautiful face and a seductive figure. She was given typecast roles as exotic, mysterious seductresses. Her famous quote, "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid," was filled with bitter, unspoken irony. She was bored, deathly bored, and while the world admired her beauty on screen, she would return home from the set, wipe off her makeup, spread blueprints on the floor, and work on her inventions. She designed an improved aircraft wing, based on the shape of the fastest birds and fish, a fluorescent dog collar, and a dissolvable tablet that turned plain water into a carbonated drink. Most of these ideas were eccentric and impractical, but the one crucial problem she had first heard about at her tyrant husband's dinner table still lingered in her mind: the problem of the vulnerability of radio-controlled torpedoes. Meanwhile, World War II had broken out in Europe. Hitler was conquering one country after another. Every day, the newspapers brought terrible news of German U-boats, the wolf packs, relentlessly sinking Allied ships in the Atlantic, including passenger liners carrying refugees. And Hedy, a Jewish woman who had fled from Nazi-occupied Austria, felt a sense of guilt and powerlessness. She was a Hollywood star. She could sell war bonds and entertain troops. But she wanted to do something real, something that would help defeat the Nazis who had destroyed her old world. And then she realized she had a weapon, not her beauty, but her mind. and the very idea that had been nagging at her, the idea of how to make torpedoes invisible to enemy jammers. She lacked only one thing, a partner who could translate her brilliant insight into the language of technology. And soon she found him. He was the most unlikely collaborator imaginable, an avant-garde, composer, virtuoso pianist, and rebel named George Antheil. Together, at the piano in the Hollywood diva's living room, they would make a discovery that was half a century ahead of its time. In 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies over the English Channel, and German U-boats, like packs of hungry wolves, mercilessly tore apart Atlantic convoys, Hedy Lamarr lived in a strange, fractured, almost schizophrenic world. By day, she was the queen of Hollywood, a perfect product of the dream factory. She was surrounded by the flattery of assistants, the flashes of paparazzi cameras, and endless, empty conversations about contracts, fees, and society gossip. She starred in films, dazzled at premieres, and maintained with cool detachment the image of a mysterious European goddess, carefully crafted for her by MGM. But at night, when the Hollywood masquerade ended, when the phones fell silent and the guests departed, she would lock herself in her library. She would remove her diamonds, wash off her makeup, and transform into another person, a self-taught engineer obsessed with a single idea: how to help the Allies win the war that was consuming her native Europe. She knew that one of the U.S. Navy's main technical challenges was its radio-controlled torpedoes. They were a powerful, promising, but highly unreliable weapon. The enemy, using a simple radio interceptor, could easily determine the frequency on which the guidance signal was transmitted from the ship to the torpedo. And once identified, they could just as easily jam it by broadcasting a powerful noise signal on the same frequency. The torpedo, now blind and deaf, would lose control, veer off course, and become a useless, expensive piece of iron adrift on the waves. It was like trying to shout to a friend in a deafeningly noisy room where everyone is screaming at once. A way had to be found to transmit the command so the enemy couldn't drown it out. The idea that came to Hedy was not just clever, was counterintuitive, elegant, and absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. What if the transmitter on the ship and the receiver on the torpedo didn't stay on a single, vulnerable frequency, but instead constantly and synchronously hopped from one frequency to another at high speed, in a pseudo-random, predetermined sequence? It would be as if two people in a noisy room, in order to talk, had prearranged to run from one corner to another every second while continuing their conversation. An outsider listening in, or an enemy jammer tuned to one corner, would only hear snippets of phrases, incoherent noise. They couldn't jam the entire conversation because they would never know which corner, which frequency the speakers would be on in the next moment. To eavesdrop or jam them, they would have to either know the exact sequence of their movements or place a jammer in every corner of the room simultaneously. This concept, frequency hopping spread spectrum, as it's known today, was a true breakthrough. But it was just a beautiful idea, a physical principle. Hedy, for all her talent, didn't know how to implement it technically. How could you make two devices, a transmitter and a receiver, miles apart in the open sea, switch frequencies in perfect synchronization, like two perfectly calibrated Swiss watches? The slightest desynchronization would mean the connection was lost. She needed an expert in synchronization. And here, fate, or chance, presented her with the most unexpected and important gift of her life. At a Hollywood party, she met a man named George Antheil. Antheil was her complete opposite. If she was the embodiment of Hollywood glamour, he was the personification of avant-garde rebellion. He was a composer, the bad boy of classical music, whose works shocked audiences. His most famous creation, Ballet Mécanique, was written for an orchestra of 16 synchronized player pianos, several airplane propellers, electric bells, and factory sirens. Its 1926 premiere in Paris ended in a massive scandal and a brawl in the audience. He was a rebel, an experimenter, a man obsessed with the idea of mechanical synchronization. Hedy invited him to her home. The supposed reason for the meeting was a consultation about her endocrine system. Antheil, at one point in his turbulent life, had written popular medical articles to make money and considered himself an expert. But soon, to the composer's surprise, the conversation shifted from hormones to torpedoes. And when Hedy, sketching diagrams on a napkin and explaining everything in surprisingly precise technical language, laid out her idea of frequency hopping, Antheil was stunned. Not by her legendary beauty, but by her brilliant, unfeminine mind, as it seemed to him. He, like no one else, understood the core of the problem of perfect synchronization. And the solution came to him almost instantly, by association. He remembered his Ballet Mécanique. To make 16 player pianos perform a complex score in absolute unison, he had used perforated paper rolls, similar to those used in popular player pianos of the time. A roller with pins moved along the paper, and depending on the location of the holes, the correct keys were pressed at the right moment. "That's it," he exclaimed. They could use 2 identical rollers with identical paper rolls, one in the transmitter on the ship and one in the receiver on the torpedo. 2 miniature, perfectly identical mechanisms started at the same time. These rotating rollers would close contacts and switch radio frequencies in a sequence that was predetermined but appeared completely random to the enemy. The number of possible frequencies was limited only by the width of the radio band. As a stylistic flourish, they decided to use 88 frequencies, corresponding to the number of keys on a piano. Imagine the genius and elegance of this solution for its time. In an era of bulky vacuum tube radios, without any computers, transistors, or microchips, they created a completely secure, unhackable wireless communication system, using the simple and reliable technology of a player piano. To jam such a signal, the enemy would have to jam all 88 frequencies simultaneously, which would require enormous power and make the jammer easily detectable. Or they would need to know the exact melody, the sequence of hops recorded on the paper roll, which was virtually impossible. For several months, they worked on their invention. The luxurious living room of Hollywood's most beautiful actress turned into an engineering office. The floors, covered with Persian rugs, were littered with blueprints and calculations. They were an incredible, almost comical pair. The dazzling movie diva in a silk dressing gown and the eccentric composer with disheveled hair, poring over schematics for a secret weapon by lamplight. They named their system simply and functionally the Secret Communication System. Filled with patriotic enthusiasm, they were certain their invention could change the course of the war at sea and save thousands of lives. In June 1941, they filed a patent application. Then, through an acquaintance, Hedy submitted the blueprints and a detailed description to the newly formed National Inventors Council, an organization tasked with collecting and analyzing useful ideas from the civilian population. And here they faced their first, most bitter, and most humiliating disappointment. When military officials and engineers from the U.S. Navy saw the patent, signed by a Hollywood actress known for a scandalous film and an avant-garde musician, they treated it with undisguised, arrogant disdain. The idea itself seemed too complex, cumbersome, and utterly impractical. A mechanism based on a player piano inside a torpedo. It sounded like the ravings of a lunatic, like science fiction. They didn't even bother to conduct serious tests, dismissing the invention as the amateurish hobby of two eccentric celebrities. As for Hedy Lamarr herself, they gave her a mocking, humiliating piece of advice. They told her she would be of far more use to her new country if she used not her questionable intellect, but her indisputable beauty. They suggested she tour the country selling war bonds, signing autographs, and kissing soldiers who purchased large denomination bonds. It was a crushing blow to her pride. She offered them a weapon that could save thousands of lives, and they saw her as just a pretty picture capable of selling government paper. Nevertheless, she agreed. She was a patriot. She accepted the rules of this cynical game. And she succeeded. On one tour alone, she personally sold $25 million worth of bonds, an astronomical sum at the time, using her fame and charm. But the bitterness of having her true brainchild, her genuine, brilliant contribution to the war effort, rejected and ridiculed, stayed with her forever. On August 10, 1942, Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil were granted U.S. Patent number 2,292,387 for a secret communications system. This document, now housed in the National Archives, is irrefutable proof of their invention. But it brought them nothing but moral satisfaction. They voluntarily assigned it to the government, waiving all commercial rights, in the naive hope that it would one day serve their country. The U.S. Navy shelved the patent. The project was classified as top secret and forgotten. The war raged on. Allied ships continued to sink in the cold waters of the Atlantic, and a brilliant invention, decades ahead of its time, gathered dust in an archive. Hedy Lamarr returned to her loathsome work in Hollywood, to roles as exotic seductresses and empty society chatter, hiding behind her dazzling but now sorrowful smile a profound disappointment and unspoken resentment. She had no idea that her idea had not died. It had merely fallen asleep, only to awaken decades later in a new, electronic era and change the world in ways she could never have imagined. But this awakening would come too late. For the world, it would be a technological revolution. For her, it would be only a bitter echo of missed opportunities and unrecognized genius. The war years marked the golden twilight of Hedy Lamarr's fame and the beginning of the long, painful night of her obscurity. On screen, she was a queen, the highest-grossing and most desired actress at the powerful MGM studio. Her exotic, aristocratic beauty was the perfect form of escapism for a nation weary of war. Her films, such as Tortilla Flat and the film noir The Strange Woman, drew packed houses. Soldiers on the fronts in Europe and the Pacific cut her pictures out of Life and Look magazines and pinned them up in their barracks and on the inside of their tanks. She was a symbol of the glamorous, peaceful, ideal life for which they fought and died. But outside the spotlight of the film set, in her real life, her world increasingly resembled ruins. The military officials' refusal to even seriously consider her invention inflicted a deep, unhealing wound on her pride. For the first time in her life, she encountered the reality that her mind, which she perhaps valued even more than her beauty, was not just unappreciated, but ridiculed and humiliated. This bred in her a deep, corrosive cynicism and disillusionment with the system she had so sincerely wanted to help. She threw herself into Hollywood life, but without her former enthusiasm, now with a sense of doom. Her personal life was a chaotic, painful kaleidoscope. She married and divorced with alarming frequency, desperately trying to find what she never had: stability, understanding, and an intellectual partnership. She married actor John Loder, Swiss restaurateur Teddy Stauffer, and Texas oil tycoon Howard Lee. Each new marriage began with a lavish wedding and press headlines and ended in a scandalous divorce and another scar on her heart. She had 6 husbands, gave birth to 2 children, and adopted another. But she never found a partner who could see past her dazzling, almost intimidating exterior to her true, complex, and vulnerable inner world. Hollywood, which had so quickly placed her on a pedestal, proved to be a cruel and merciless machine for processing human lives. After World War II, public tastes changed dramatically. The exotic, mysterious, aristocratic goddesses like her and Greta Garbo were replaced by simpler, more down-to-earth, girl-next-door types like June Allison or Doris Day. Her career went into a steep decline. MGM, for whom she was no longer a cash cow, offered her fewer roles, and those she was offered were but pale shadows of her former glory, exploiting her fading beauty. In the 1950s, she tried to become a producer herself to regain control of her career and life, but this bold venture also failed. She, the most beautiful woman in the world, watched in horror as time, stress, sleepless nights, and disappointments began to leave their merciless marks on her face. She became one of the first Hollywood stars obsessed with the idea of eternal youth and desperately threw herself into the arms of the nascent field of plastic surgery. But plastic surgery at the time was crude, imperfect, and experimental. The numerous operations that were meant to restore her youth only distorted her once perfect, harmonious features, turning her vibrant, expressive face into a frozen, unnatural, and sorrowful mask. By the early 1960s, her career was effectively over. She appeared in public less and less frequently. Her name began to surface in the newspapers, not in society columns, but in humiliating, scandalous headlines. In 1966, she was arrested for shoplifting. A woman who had earned millions was caught trying to steal items worth less than $100. It was not an act of need. It was a desperate, irrational cry for help, a sign of a deep psychological breakdown, depression, and possibly kleptomania. The court acquitted her, but the humiliation was immense. That same year, her scandalous so-called autobiography, Ecstasy and Me, was published, written by a ghostwriter and filled with fabricated, vulgar, and salacious details about her sex life. Hedy sued the publisher, claiming the book was a complete fabrication and libel, and even won the case. But her reputation was irreparably damaged. She grew increasingly withdrawn and suspicious, becoming a voluntary recluse. She stopped leaving her house, communicating with the world, even with her own children, only by telephone, sometimes for 6 or 7 hours a day. The most beautiful woman in the world no longer wanted the world to see her face. She died to the public long before her physical death, becoming a Hollywood legend, a ghost from the past. And while Hedy Lamarr's star was slowly and tragically fading in this self-imposed prison of solitude, her forgotten, buried invention was beginning its own secret, thrilling life. Patent number 2,292,387, signed with the names Hedy Keesler Markey, her surname from her husband at the time, and George Antheil, had been gathering dust in the Pentagon's archives for decades. It was one of thousands of unrealized projects, a strange whim born in the minds of a movie star and a composer. But the idea embedded within it proved too powerful, too fundamental to die. In the late 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, when the world lived under the shadow of the mushroom cloud, the U.S. military once again faced the problem of completely secure communications. Now it was no longer just about torpedoes. A reliable communication system was needed for strategic bombers, nuclear submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. A system that could not be jammed or intercepted by Soviet electronic warfare specialists. Engineers working on this problem in the secret labs of companies like Sylvania tried numerous options. And then, someone, sifting through old archives in search of fresh ideas, stumbled upon a strange, eccentric patent from the World War II era. When engineers, now armed not with mechanics, but with the new revolutionary transistor technology, studied Lamarr and Anthiel's patent, they were astonished. The idea that their predecessors had dismissed as the ravings of a madman 2 decades earlier turned out to be brilliant in its simplicity and elegance. They, of course, discarded the mechanical rollers and perforated paper. Instead, they used compact electronic pseudo-random code generators, capable of switching frequencies at incredible speeds. But the fundamental principle, frequency hopping, remained unchanged. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world stood on the brink of nuclear war for 13 days, this technology, codenamed Frequency Hopping Spread Spectrum, FHSS, was secretly installed for the first time on U.S. warships enforcing the naval blockade of Cuba. It provided completely secure, unhackable communication between the fleet's ships, which the numerous Soviet submarines and reconnaissance vessels in the area could neither jam nor monitor. The Hollywood actress's invention, created to fight the Nazis, found its first combat application in the most tense standoff of the Cold War. This was only its secret debut. The frequency-hopping technology proved so effective and reliable that it became the basis for most secret military communication systems in the U.S. and NATO countries. It was used in reconnaissance satellites, guidance systems for smart bombs and cruise missiles, Army radios, and espionage equipment. Its existence was one of the Pentagon's most closely guarded secrets. Hedy Lamarr's name, of course, was never mentioned. Her patent had long expired, and having generously given it to the government, she had no legal or financial rights to it. Decades passed. The Cold War ended, and in the mid-1980s, the Pentagon, realizing the technology was no longer unique, decided to declassify the spread spectrum principle, allowing its use for civilian purposes. This quiet and unassuming decision sparked a technological revolution comparable to the invention of the transistor or the Internet. Engineers in the private sector, gaining access to this technology, instantly recognized its colossal commercial potential. It allowed multiple different wireless devices to operate in the same crowded radio spectrum with virtually no interference, as each one hopped along its own unique frequency path. This became the key to creating the wireless world that had once only been a dream. The principle laid out in Hedy Lamarr's patent became the foundation for the first CDMA mobile phones. Then, in the 1990s, came Wi-Fi technology, which allowed our computers and laptops to communicate with each other and access the Internet without wires. Then came Bluetooth, connecting our phones to headphones, speakers, and car systems. Then came the Global Positioning System, GPS, which allows us to navigate anywhere on the planet. Virtually every modern wireless technology we use every second of every day is based on that fundamental principle of frequency hopping that Hedy Lamarr and George Anthiel conceived in a Hollywood living room back in 1940. They created the foundation upon which the entire modern digital, mobile, wireless world was built. And all this time, Hedy Lamarr herself lived in complete obscurity and poverty in her small, cluttered apartment in Florida. She had no idea what a revolution her long-forgotten invention had sparked. She watched as the world around her changed rapidly, as mobile phones, laptops, and wireless internet appeared, never suspecting that these were her intellectual children. Justice began to be restored slowly, painfully slowly, only in the late 1990s. A group of technology history enthusiasts, studying old military patents, stumbled upon patent number 2,292,387 and were shocked to see the famous actress's name on it. They began an investigation, and the truth, buried for half a century, began to emerge. The scientific and technological community was in shock. It turned out they had been using a technology for decades without knowing the name of its true creator. In 1997, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, one of the most respected organizations in the tech world, awarded Hedy Lamarr, then 83 years old, a special prize for her pioneering contribution. It was the first, belated, almost awkward recognition of her genius. When they called to inform her of the award, she, who had not left her home in years, responded with her famous, bitterly ironic phrase, "Well, it's about time." But this was only the beginning of her posthumous triumph. She did not yet know that after her death, her name would be inscribed in the National Inventors Hall of Fame, alongside those of Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and the Wright brothers. She, the Hollywood goddess, would take her rightful place in the pantheon of humanity's greatest minds. The phone call from the Electronic Frontier Foundation in 1997 was like a ray of light struggling to pierce the tightly drawn curtains of Hedy Lamarr's dark, reclusive life. Her short, almost indifferent, yet bitterly ironic phrase, "Well, it's about time," was more than just a reply. It was an exhale of relief, an exhale 56 years in the making. 56 long, empty years, during which her greatest intellectual achievement was first buried under a top-secret classification, and then, even more insultingly, dissolved into the anonymity of the commercial technologies that were changing the world. For the first time in half a century, someone had finally seen the sharp, analytical mind of an inventor behind the legendary face of a movie star. This award, bestowed by a small but influential group of digital pioneers, was the stone that started an avalanche. The story of the mother of Wi-Fi, hiding in the guise of Hollywood's most glamorous goddess, was so incredible, so cinematic, that it was eagerly picked up by major global media outlets. Articles in Forbes and the New York Times, documentaries on the Discovery Channel. The world suddenly, with surprise and shame, rediscovered Hedy Lamarr. But it was no longer the actress from black and white films they were discovering, but a genius whose work underpinned their daily lives. The tech giants of Silicon Valley, engineers, programmers, scientists, all were in shock. It turned out that for decades, without knowing it, they had been standing not on the shoulders of a giant, but of a fragile, incredibly beautiful woman they had only thought of as an object of male fantasy. For Hedy herself, this belated recognition, which crashed down on her in her old age, was both a triumph and a quiet tragedy. She was already in her 80s. She was ill, frail, and still living a completely reclusive life in her small, cluttered apartment in Florida. She flatly refused all interviews and would not appear in public to receive her awards. She did not want the world, which remembered her as young, perfect, and dazzlingly beautiful, to see her old, her face distorted by botched plastic surgeries, her gaze dimmed. She accepted her newfound fame, but she accepted it from a distance, through her only link to the outside world, the telephone. Her son, Anthony Loder, recalled that when he brought her one of the prestigious awards, she took it, held it silently in her hands for a long time, looked at it, and then said quietly, "This is good, but I think I deserved it earlier." In that simple, unpretentious sentence lay the pain of her life. The pain that recognition had come too late, when it could no longer change anything. It could not bring back her missed opportunities, could not give her the career as a scientist or engineer she might have had in another world, in a different, more just life. It could not compensate for the decades during which she was considered nothing more than a beautiful airhead, whose opinion on any subject other than fashion and makeup was not worth a dime. She died in her sleep on January 19, 2000, at the age of 85. She died alone, as she had lived for the last decades of her life. According to her will, her son scattered a portion of her ashes in her native Austria, in the Vienna woods, where she, as a little girl named Hedwig Kiesler, once walked with her father, who was the first to see in her not just a pretty child, but a future inventor, explaining to her how the world worked. It was a symbolic return to her roots, to a time when her mind was valued more than her face. And it was here, after her physical death, that her true, immortal ascent began. Now that her earthly life, full of scandals, failed marriages, and disappointments, was over, the world could finally appreciate the full scope of her personality without being distracted by her biography. In 2014, the centenary of her birth, the main event that solidified her status in history took place. Her name was solemnly inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in the United States. She joined the ranks of Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, the Wright brothers, and Henry Ford, in the pantheon of the greatest minds who changed humanity. Hedy Lamarr, the Hollywood diva, the ecstasy girl, was officially and forever recognized as one of the pillars of modern technological civilization. Her story became a powerful symbol, an inspiration for thousands of women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM, worldwide. She became proof that genius has no gender, and that even the strongest stereotypes can be broken, even if it takes a lifetime. In Austria, Germany, and Switzerland, her birthday, November 9th, is now officially celebrated as Inventor's Day, in honor of the woman whose mind proved to be as dazzling as her beauty. So who was she in the end, this amazing, paradoxical woman? Was she a genius who accidentally stumbled into the movies, or a movie star who had a random flash of brilliance? The truth is, she was both, and therein lies her uniqueness and her tragedy. She was a rare, almost impossible phenomenon. Her analytical mind and her phenomenal beauty were not two different poles, but two sides of one incredibly gifted personality. But she was born in an era that was not ready to accept such complexity and duality, especially in a woman. The world of the 20th century was a world of simple, convenient labels. You were either smart or beautiful, either an actress or a scientist. The world simply didn't know which box to put her in, so it chose the simplest and most obvious one, the box labeled beauty. And, blinded by the radiance of her appearance, it criminally ignored, failed to notice, the brilliance of her mind. Her story is not just about Wi-Fi. It is a powerful, universal parable about unrecognized genius, the crushing power of social stereotypes, and the cruel, poignant irony of fate. She gave the world an idea that connected billions of people into a single global wireless network. Yet she herself died in profound, almost absolute solitude. She gave us the ability to communicate instantly with one another from opposite ends of the planet. Yet at the end of her life, she could only communicate with the world through a cold telephone line. Today, when you take out your smartphone to connect to Wi-Fi at a cafe, when you put on your Bluetooth headphones to listen to music, when you use the GPS navigator in your car to find your way, stop for a second and remember her. Remember Hedy Lamarr, the woman who proved that the strongest and purest signal can come from the most unexpected source, and that behind the most beautiful face in history can hide one of the sharpest and most fruitful minds, one that gave us the future. Her physical beauty faded with time, as all mortal beauty does, but her idea, her invisible, elegant dance of frequencies, proved to be immortal.